patients with indolent lymphoma who progress less than 2 years from their frontline anti-CD20 containing immunotherapy have a very poor prognosis, with 5 years overall survival are just about 50%. And in the pivotal ZUMA-1 study, which was testing the axicabtagene in patients with diffuse large B-cell lymphoma and transformed lymphoma and primary mediastinal lymphoma, axicabtagene showed very high overall response rates of 83% with 58% of CR rates, and at 3 years of follow-up, still 47% of patients were alive. And that was the rationale behind the current study, the ZUMA-5, which is a multi-center single-arm phase 2 study evaluating the axicabtagene in patients with relapsed refractory follicular or marginal zone lymphoma who relapse after 2 or more prior lines of therapy. The study planned 160 patients for enrollment, and most of the enrolled patients, 125 patients, were follicular lymphoma, and a minority was marginal zone lymphoma, 35%. And similar to the ZUMA-1, the key eligibility criteria was relapsed refractory grade 1 to grade 3A follicular lymphoma, marginal zone lymphoma, whether nodal or extranodal, and more than or equal to prior to 2 lines of prior therapy. That must have included anti-CD20 monoclonal antibody with an alkylating agent and the same conditioning regimen 5 days prior to the infusion of fludarabine and cyclophosphamide, and the standard dose of axicabtagene at 2 million CAR T cells per kg. And the primary endpoint was the overall response rate. The study enrolled a total of 148 patients, 127 follicular lymphoma and 20 marginal zone lymphoma, and 140 patients were dosed and 8 were not treated for variable reasons. And for the efficacy analysis, 96 patients were evaluated, 80 follicular lymphoma who had more than or equal to 9 months of follow-up, and 16 patients with marginal zone lymphoma with at least 1 month of follow-up. For the safety analysis, all the 140 patients who were treated were evaluated. More than 40% of patients were above the age of 65, which is reflective of what we see in clinical practice. 49% were males, and if we look at the disease characteristics, 52% had advanced stage disease, stage 4, with high FLIPI score of 3 or more at 51%, and 49% had high tumor bulk, and these were heavily pretreated population, which is similar to what we see in real world in follicular lymphoma patients. In particular, 2/3 or 70% had 3 or more prior lines of chemotherapy. 1/3 of them had a prior PI3K inhibitor, and 75% had refractory disease, and quarter of them received prior autologous stem cell transplantation. And if we look at the responses, and in the all patients, responses were remarkable with 93% of overall response. And if we focus on the 80 patients who had follicular lymphoma, responses were higher, 95%, and 81% had CR, and the median time to first response was quite short at 1 month. And among patients with follicular lymphoma, 13% who had an initial response of PR later converted to a CR. That's quite remarkable with these heavily pretreated patients. where responses are not expected to exceed 50%, if ever. And the responses were pretty consistent across all subgroups. And again, this is reflective of the nature of the treatment, which does really seem to overcome the resistant nature of the disease, because it does depend on finding a target rather than the biologic nature of the lymphoma. However, this still needs to be further studied. When we look at duration of response, with a median duration of 15.3 months, and for all patients, duration of response was 20.8 months. 68% of patients with follicular lymphoma still had ongoing responses. However, the duration of response is still to be evaluated with longer follow-up, given the nature of the disease, which has an indolent nature. However, this is a signal that there might be durable responses that could last for longer periods of time among this otherwise poor prognosis patient population. And further, among patients who had a CR, 18% and 18% of patients with PR, looks like responses lasted for more than a year. Again, if we look at the progression-free survival and overall survival for patients with follicular lymphoma, the median was not reached, and the median PFS in all patients was 23.5 months. That's close to 2 years, and that 12 months overall survival was 94.3%. Again, this is reflective of potentially durable responses. If we look at those adverse events, it's not markedly different from the ZUMA-1 trial, and the most common grade 3 adverse events were neutropenia, as expected. Cytopenias are a major side effect of CAR T-cell therapy. Patients with marginal zone lymphoma had higher incidence of CRS and higher grades of CRS as well. Interestingly, the median time of onset was 4 days, and this is in contrast to 2 days in the original ZUMA-1 study, and the median duration was 6 days among patients with follicular lymphoma. This might have implications when we administer this treatment as an outpatient, and in 99% of patients, the cytokine release syndrome resolved. In Canada, we don't have PI3K inhibitor approved therapy. This could be an alternative for those patients who otherwise would have been treated on a palliative approach, and this could be a potentially curative treatment for those patients' population, which could be administered once with a pretty manageable safety profile, which looks to be largely reversible. However, these responses still need to be validated and tracked over time to focus more on the durability of response. However, looks like responses will be potentially durable.